This is a cyber attack simulation, really a tabletop exercise. We have not done one since March 2020. It was the week before COVID kicked in, and Lisa Ropple has been running our tabletop exercise since really the inception of the Boston Conference on Cybersecurity. Lisa is a partner at Jones Day, the law firm Jones Day. She manages litigation in cybersecurity and data privacy globally. Lisa is a Holy Cross grad, BC law grad, and she also is, always plugs, and also is on our Business Advisory Council for the Masters in Cybersecurity Policy and Governance. She's a great friend, and I appreciate everything she does here for all of us at Boston College. She told me not to go over the top, so I won't. So with that, Lisa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Still did. Thank you. Well, it's great to see everybody. We're so happy to be back. As Kevin said, the last time we did this cybersecurity tabletop was before COVID. It was the week before COVID. And I remember we were making jokes about the hand sanitizer that we threw on the table, and we chuckled, ha, ha, ha. We had no idea what was coming. We found out since. And the other thing that we didn't know was coming is what happened with cyber breaches and cyber attacks and the threat landscape during COVID. When I think of COVID, you probably all think of COVID the same way. Remember being in the house just forever. I remember doing that too, but also handling like 15, 16, 17 cyber attacks all at the same time. Our capacity was strained. We were representing companies all over the world in every industry, and it was punishing, I have to say, on those companies, certainly on all the service providers to the companies, but also on the government, right? Local, state, federal governments attacked too. I'm really a little shocked that it's still continuing, right? I've been doing data breach response for 20 plus years, I can't even count. And you would expect with all of the investment of resources and all of the brain power and all of the energy that everybody's bringing to this effort, that this risk would be tamped down a little bit, right? It's a risk, risk comes out, money, thought, regulation, risk flattens, but this risk is going like this. And I can't really think of another one like it. And this morning's conversation just underscored how really dangerous a time it is for all of us. So I can say I was very buoyed by this morning because listening to especially all of our folks in government talking about the many new angles that we're taking to try to combat the risk is really encouraging. I can tell you from the private side, representing a lot of companies, that we're seeing the same kind of ramp up on private companies. Private companies work so hard at cybersecurity. They're not cybersecurity, that's not the purpose for their existence, but they invest huge resources. We see boards taking this very, very seriously. We do a lot of board education, and we advise them on the risk. And we also recommend that everybody do tabletops. So we already had Mary earlier tell everyone the good experience she's had with tabletops. I'm a huge fan. There's not a company that I've done a tabletop with that has not benefited from some way. And actually, the more you do, the better you get. So helps clarify roles, helps identify ambiguities that might be in your plan, but mostly it builds muscle memory and confidence. A lot of people aren't clear on what their role is going to be. There's politics in companies. I know that comes as a shock. And that plays a role, too, about who's going to make the decisions when the time comes. I'm delighted to have such an extensive panel. This is our biggest panel ever today. And I don't know quite how we're going to handle it, but it's a wonderful panel of people who are going to bring a whole bunch of different perspectives to our exercise. I'm going to have everybody just introduce themselves really briefly rather than introduce and then have them talk. So real quickly, why don't we start all the way in the end with Lauren?
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Zabierek. I'm a senior advisor in the Cybersecurity Division at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. And I just want to also preview that I might have to leave a little early today, so if you see me head out, that's why. It's my son's kindergarten orientation.
No, it's important CISA work. Lauren, we talked about this.
Major
Hi, everyone. I'm Kaylee Cox-Bankston. I'm a partner at the law firm of Goodwin Proctor. I've been in private practice my entire career counseling companies on both proactive and reactive cybersecurity matters.
Good afternoon, Tom Etheridge. I'm the Chief Global Services Officer at CrowdStrike. I'm responsible primarily for all of our professional services work globally, including incident response and forensics investigative services, and our managed services capabilities as well. Been with the company for about 7 years and about 30 years in the cybersecurity software space.
Thanks for your attention, everyone, at this point in the conference. We appreciate it, particularly given the large number of lawyers on this panel who've snuck on, so we appreciate that. I'm Katherine. I'm one of those lawyers. I lead IBM's privacy and AI legal team globally, and before that, I worked with people like Caleb and Gant in the room in IBM's security business unit, where I led the legal team there too.
Good morning, Jay Pasteris. I'm not a lawyer. I'm actually a CIO and a CISO for GreenPages technology. We're a cybersecurity, cloud transformation, managed service organization. I've spent probably about 20 years in similar roles and across different sectors, including education, cyber, most recently before this, the New England Journal of Medicine. So, many different roles in that over that span.
And I'm Simon Taylor, the CEO and founder of HYCU. We don't just sell purple bags that are sitting under your seats. We're the world's fastest growing backup and recovery as a service company. We've got about 3,600 customers in 78 countries, and we support 128 different federal government agencies.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mackenzie Queenin. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney in the Securities, Financial, and Cyber Fraud Unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Boston. Before joining the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was in private practice doing defensive work at Mintz Levin. I'm also a faculty member here in BC's cyber program and a proud BC Law graduate.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Burnside. I'm with Mandiant Google Cloud in their crisis comms practice. It's a newly formed practice, and I've joined the team after spending 20 years in the FBI, both as a senior liaison officer at CISA and as head of the agency's strategic communications.
That's great. Thank you to each of you. We have such impressive panelists, and I think most impressive about them is how fearless they are, because we have not told them about the scenario. They're going to be reacting live. And that takes a lot of guts. I know from past experiences on these tabletops that they're going to make it look a lot easier than it actually is. So go easy on them, but they won't really actually need it. I also give this disclaimer that each of the panelists is, of course, here in his or her own capacity and not speaking on behalf of any law enforcement agency or government agency or company. Okay, I cover everybody? Yeah, there we go. Okay, or law firm. There you go. Okay, all right. Okay, so I'm going to present a series of about 6 little fact injects and everybody here is going to play a certain role in a company. We have our CEO of the company is going to be Simon. The CISO is Jay. Katherine is our general counsel. Jennifer is our head of communications. Our outside advisors to the company are Kaylee, and she's outside counsel from Goodwin, and then Tom Etheridge from CrowdStrike. The company has CrowdStrike on retainer to help them with forensic matters and threat intelligence. So they're going to play themselves. Our government people are actually going to play themselves as well in their roles as U.S. Attorney, AUSA, and Lauren from CISA. Okay? So here's the setup. I'm going to read a scenario, and I'm going to direct some questions to various folks. All right. I'm going to get started. And by the way, none of the scenario does not in any way reflect any of the work that I might have ever done in my private practice. All right. So it's a beautiful Saturday afternoon in late June. And a third-party security researcher known as Gary Greyhat contacts Jay. Jay's the CISO of Frontline Company. So Frontline Company is a publicly traded company. It's listed on NASDAQ. And it sells tech solutions and services principally to industrial manufacturers for use in production settings, and its customers include the U.S. government. The company's headquartered in the U.S., has operations in the EU, and employs about 100,000 people. So here's Jay, the CISO, lying in his pool when he gets a message from this third-party security researcher, Gary, through LinkedIn. And he just gives you this sort of vague message. Jay says, hey, get in touch with me. I've discovered a security vulnerability. He doesn't tell you what it is. And he would like you to get back to him. So you're floating in your pool at the time this comes in, but because you're a CISO, you're clutching your phone. And you immediately see it. So what do you do? What do you do when you get that message?
So first thing I'm going to do is contact my team internally, talk about what do we know, what is the last time we've done a red team effort, have we found anything, how updated is our incident response, because I know if a gray hat hits me up, it's not for my benefit. And so I know there's going to be something behind that. So I want to make sure that's there. I want to reach out to CrowdStrike, who we have on retainer, see if they have any info on this person, see if they have any info on, is this happening anywhere else, see if they have any info on our environment. They're helping protect our environment. And then once I gain some intelligence on that, I'm going to make a decision one way or another if there's validity to this or not. But I have to start with my internal team to gain that type of that information. And in doing so, I want to make sure that I'm going to update Simon, let him know what's going on. I want to make sure that we have an incident response plan. When's the last time it was updated? Are we ready to enact that if this ends out to be an event after? And then from there, we'll reconvene every half hour until we get to more information. And then at some point, we're going to make a decision to contact or not.
All right, so you're going to treat just a potential report of a security vulnerability as though we're an incident, invoking your incident response plan.
Parts of it.
That's interesting. Okay. And you're going to notify Simon. You're going to notify Katherine?
You should probably notify Katherine.
I'm going to notify Katherine.
Okay, cool. All right. So what actually happens, Jay, is you do just as you said, and you schedule a call after you've done this with Gary Grayhat for first thing Monday morning, and you want to learn more about the report. So Gary claims to have identified a critical vulnerability in one of your publicly facing servers, right? And he stresses that if it was exploited, the vulnerability could permit an unauthorized actor to inject remote code and gain unauthorized access, privileged access. And so you, of course, thank him for the report, and you ask Gary to submit the report through your website, where you have a coordinated voluntary disclosure program like all companies do, right? So you're going to have him submit it there. You ask him to put the screenshot in, and you assure him that you'll investigate and be back in touch. And Gary says, that's great, but I'd like to help. Why don't you take a look at a contract I'm going to send you? And for a mere $500 an hour, I'll help you investigate and remediate that vulnerability. I know where it is. I've already got a head start. Why don't we do that? So, Jay, you tell Gary that you need to speak with others in the company, and you hang up, and you call Katherine again. So the question is, Jay and Katherine, how do you view that proposal?
We view that proposal with great suspicion. And we will also, continue to be in touch with Tom to see what Tom has learned about Gary and his behavior and his willingness to speak at conferences and brag about his great security skills and his interest in the industry more generally to help frame our understanding of Gary's intentions. But we would not want a random gray hat to be paid by us for undefined, using a contract that he pulled off of ChatGPT, undefined security services.
Right.
Wild
And
guess.
Simon, do you have a view at this point? As CEO, they come and tell you, gee, we've got this reach out. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm very glad that they've told me. I would concur with our general counsel that we absolutely should not participate with that individual. And then I'd be calling my engineers to understand why we have this flaw to begin with in the servers. And I'd want to understand if that vulnerability was something that has already been exploited. And I'd most likely at that point say that, how much of our data and infrastructure is actually backed up? Is there an ability for us to recover in the event of an attack? And I think I'd probably go down that path.
Right, so you're pivoting from not just remediating the vulnerability, but making sure that someone hasn't already exploited it.
Absolutely.
And I would say some companies, in our experience, they're really good at the first part of this and maybe not so good on the second part. Just sort of like, I remediated, I patched, right? But not looking to see if they already got it in the door.
And teams should be pulling log data at this point, right, to discover that, right?
So you might do a forensic investigation, and you'd be doing this internally at this point,
That's
right,
correct.
with internal resources.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, so so you decide to send Gary away, and you're doing your own investigation. I should ask one other question. You talked about anybody else in the company other than Katherine? Katherine knows where I'm going. Anybody else you're going to talk to in the company while this is going on?
I would recommend that we connect with Jennifer as well, given how gray hats generally tend to react when they are not taking up on their offer to provide services.
So that feeds very well into this next one, Jennifer, which you're going to need to address. So yes, in fact, the company decides we're going to investigate. We're not going to deal with Gary. Jay calls Gary up and tells him that. A day later, Tom from CrowdStrike, doing his job and threat intelligence, contacts Jay and says that Gary has published a blog that discloses the vulnerability, says out there exactly what it is, shows a screenshot, and then tells everyone that the company has not been responsive, that he had notified the company and they had not remediated it. So what do we do now? I think, Jennifer, maybe we go to you here.
Absolutely. So one of the most important things for clients to know is to have their stakeholders mapped. And by that I mean the media could be one stakeholder, but their own employees, their obviously their customers. And if we do have any information to share from Tom's team on the incident response side, getting that actionable intelligence to those downstream customers. Because today we're seeing an ever-increasing number of supply chain attacks, right? So that would be definitely one of the big things. The other piece is those regulatory agencies, whether it's CISA or the FBI or other critical infrastructure protection partners, making sure that they are included in that stakeholder mapping, and ensuring too that our channels are ready. So in some attacks, obviously, if we are bricked or if our infrastructure is impacted, we may not have that ability to communicate outward. So making sure we have that focus as part of our incident response planning and process.
Right, out-of-band communication is very key, and you know, it seems sort of obvious, right? But it's something that companies get wrong a lot, is that they don't have any way to communicate. We've had companies global companies, very sophisticated companies, down for several weeks, just because they had no out-of-band way to communicate, and also they didn't have each other's phone numbers. Mm-hmm. True. Okay, all right, so the next development. So Jay's team is continuing to investigate. Right? You don't have findings yet. Gary goes quiet. There's no further announcement. July 4th weekend's coming, nice and quiet. So Jay finally gets back in the pool. And he's floating along in the pool with his phone when the lead IR analyst from the SOC calls him and says, you know, saw some funky stuff this morning, started looking into it, and all of a sudden the systems were crashing, and we got this message, seems to be generated by some malware, from some group called Hack Attack. And they've claimed to have deployed some ransomware, and they've claimed to have stolen a large amount of data. They haven't told us what kind of data. So tells the company, you can click a link, you can go to the dark web, and you'll find more information there, and you better do it by a certain date, or we're gonna publish the data we stole. So Jay gets out of the pool again, and immediately calls Katherine again and assembles the whole team, your incident response team. So what's on your mind? How do you organize the many things you're thinking about at this point? What are some of them, and what's the most important in your mind? We'll start with you, Jay.
You say me?
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to, at this point, I want to understand, you know, what's the scope of this, and I want to start to understand, are the bad guys still in? What are they doing? Can we eradicate? Offline, we want to establish those out-of-band communications. A lot of times they're looking at communications when they're still in, and they're surveilling that to find out what your next move is. So as we do that, we find out if they're in. Now we want to start to bring things down. We have to bring things down, certain things, and we want to contain the breach. At that point, we're going to be reaching out to communication department. We're going to be bringing Simon in. We're going to be, you know, bringing our attorney in. We're going to be bringing our insurance company in to find out, you know, let them know we have this potential breach. Mm-hmm. And at this point, we'd probably be reaching out to legal authorities as well.
What about CrowdStrike? So do you reach out to Tom? Tom, what are you thinking from where you sit? Is Jay's response where his head should be?
While I was listening to all the conversations, I was thinking about breakout time. So what we've been reporting is that the average breakout time from the time a threat actor has access to the environment till they start moving laterally towards objectives has lowered from, I think it was 92 minutes last year, it's down to 84. So I'm assuming 84 minutes has well gone bye-bye in all of these interactions, and that means if the threat actor did take advantage of that exploit, they're probably in the environment and they're probably moving towards action on objectives. We would absolutely want to make sure we have technology deployed to get visibility into the breach, understand what's going on, if the threat actor is still moving in the environment, if they've been able to establish persistence mechanisms, if they have taken data, which they claim to have taken data, we would want to investigate that and start to understand what data was taken, how much of it was taken, and when it was taken. Those would be some of the key things we would be focusing on.
Right. Kaylee and Katherine, what are you guys thinking about from a legal perspective?
Yeah, so I can say from an in-house perspective, given what we're seeing, we would likely be reaching out to outside counsel and having outside counsel use the retainer agreement they already magically had in place with CrowdStrike too, so that the work that CrowdStrike is doing to help review this and the work that is being done internally could be protected under privilege. In-house counsel can do a privilege investigation as well, but it's cleaner if it's outside counsel. And given the indicators we're seeing, it's time to get Kaylee involved.
I would agree with that. And you know, as outside counsel, we have great relationships with folks like CrowdStrike, and in this particular case, they would already be on retainer. So, you know, obviously the first priority in this incident is the security of the company, and we recognize that as outside counsel, so we're not going to let contracting and paperwork get in the way of that. And when we have close relationships with vendors like CrowdStrike, we move very quickly, and we're all aligned on the same page there. So the first priority would be the security of the company, and we need that investigation to inform our advice as legal counsel. So just because the threat actor is saying they've taken this information, they've posted it, even if they have posted some alleged sample data online, we're not taking the position that all of their claims are true. We have to investigate and validate that, and that would tie in very closely with any communication strategy. And so whether or not we've received any media inquiries, I think we'd start working closely with the communications team to have holding statements ready in case word of this leaks on Twitter or elsewhere, so that we're completely aligned on what our messaging is from the company.
Great. Okay, so
It's important too. You got to preserve logs, right? You got to preserve the environment. Too many times it happens, and the natural reaction is to start rebuilding. But it's important you preserve that data. That's how we're going to get to the point of what happened, when happened, who was it, where'd the data go, what happened to the data, how'd they get in.
Right.
So that's one of the critical steps. You got to communicate that across the technology tech teams at the beginning.
That's a really good point, because we do see sometimes with vulnerabilities reported to companies that they're remediated by turning off the server, which is a good idea, but it's not a good idea when you turn it on and everything's gone, right? So there always have to be a balance of interest between containment and preservation of data for law enforcement, for your own internal investigations, which there's so much we could talk about all the things that a company has to do at this point. You guys have hit on the big ones, but let's pivot to actually three specific questions. The first one is, should the company click on the link? So the ransom message says, contact us here. Who decides that? Who gets to decide that? And should they do it?
Well, not anybody should just do that.
Someone in IT, probably?
It should be somebody on the should be somebody on the security team that does that in a contained environment that is not part of the corporate environment, that has experience doing that.
Maybe you'll have CrowdStrike do it in a sandbox.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it depends also on our internal response plan, because in some cases, companies will have the board actually engaged in making the decision about whether you're even going to engage with threat actors in a context like that. So we certainly will be discussing this closely with Simon and with outside counsel, but that's a big decision. And as you say, nobody should be messing around with this internally.
Yeah. We see this oftentimes, people are just curious. So we see the IT department just clicking the button, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, bullseye, and the bad guys are focused right on you. It doesn't mean you're not going to do it, but you want to make sure you have an internal process with everyone at the table making that decision. Okay, well, here, you had an internal debate, and you decided to click. And when you clicked, you got to the dark website, and you see a demand for $15 million in Bitcoin, and you have 7 days, and they're going to give you the decryption key, because now you've determined that most of your servers are encrypted, and they promise that they won't publish the data. There's also a link there that gives sample files for what they took. So you can't tell how much they took, and you can't tell what portion these samples represent, but you can see some file folders in there. And we can see, the company sees, that the files that are samples include personnel files, internal strategic plans, pricing information, customer proprietary information, including information from U.S. government customers. So at this point, Jay strongly feels that the company has to go to law enforcement. Right? We have to go to the FBI and to CISA, works with CISA all the time, in these cooperative efforts to shore up security. He wants to go, give them the information, and collaborate. And he also thinks that in those communications, that vulnerability that Gary reported should be disclosed. Not sure the forensic investigation has connected those two things yet, but this is the position that Jay has. Simon does not agree. And so we have a conflict. I think we're going to hear from the internal people about the pros and cons, but we're first going to start with what the regulators would think, or law enforcement would think about this. And we're going to start with Lauren and Mackenzie to tell us what your perspective is on whether the company should be coming to you with this decision now.
Well, I know you attended the last panel on the value of partnerships. So of course my answer is yes, you should involve law enforcement. And our pitch is sort of this. Long term, the government might be able to help you identify and prosecute the bad actor. But that's more long term, and that takes time. In the immediate sense, what the government can do is help identify the MO of that actor. So we have all sorts of data about what sorts of processes bad actors are using. And the reason that's important is it may help you to stop the bleeding. It may help the company identify areas of their network that might be at risk and they don't realize it. And we might also have information about whether that bad actor has terrorist connections, which is relevant because of OFAC regulations surrounding the payment of ransomware.
Could I jump in very quickly and just give an opposing viewpoint on this? So, and again, I'm not necessarily recommending this, but what I see a lot with clients is massive amounts of fear with going to you, right? And the fear comes in two parts. The first is we know that it's not the value of the ransom that we're going to have to pay. It's the 7x business lack of continuity that's going to be so disruptive to us. So if it's $1 million that we have to pay out, I'm going to have $7 million in business and continuity. It's going to be a really, really big problem for me. So what I'm thinking about is how do I get online quick, fast, and with as least disruption as possible? And how do I manage the optics with my board? How do I manage the optics with my customer base? And I know one thing, which is that when I go to you, you're going to tell me, don't pay the ransom. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in terms of folks hiding these attacks is that there is such a strong communication from the government that you shouldn't pay. When in fact, in most cases, when you pay, that's how you get online faster. And so I think that's and again, that's not necessarily the right approach, but what I am saying is that is the business sort of thinking when it comes to these attacks.
I think there's another component to that too is,
I would like to respond.
Our IR partner, they've seen these bad guys before. They have negotiated with these bad guys before. They've seen, hey, this group is notorious for these things. They usually do give you data back, or they don't, and they're going to come back a second time, and they're going to post it anyway, so don't negotiate with them, right? So I think the IR company, in the information they have there, having to deal with these all the time and knowing who the bad guys are is incredibly important in that decision.
So I think in real life, I think these are all perspectives that we encounter in every ransom case, and it's sort of a balance. I will say, just from our local perspective, that dealing with the FBI office here in Boston, actually many FBI offices all around, and dealing with our friends in the U.S. Attorney's Office is not as adversarial as it might be in other places. It's actually terrific. We have great support and great relationships with the FBI. We reach out all the time and we get immediate response and help on the MO front, which is invaluable. And it really, it almost always makes clients feel better. We have a trusted relationship. But the perspective that I'm hearing from you, Simon, is one we hear from CEOs a lot of times, which is we're keeping this internal. We don't even know, and we can't manage that whole process, right? The whole law enforcement process is going to be a distraction right now. They're going to want data. They're going to prioritize their investigation. We can't get anything done, right? So there's those kind of issues too. All right, so that's whether to go to law enforcement. Lauren, did you want to talk a little bit about CISA?
Yeah, I do. Daniel King mentioned earlier, right, like the target package that a lot of the companies or organizations will receive from CISA with all this information, right? It's much, I won't say easier, but we're able to do that when we have as much information as we can get, right? So perhaps you have these concerns about sharing and for the purposes of your business, but think about how that will actually benefit so many other businesses, right? I know it's more of a collective sort of good, right? And perhaps you might be on the receiving end of that information later down the road, right? So it truly is a partnership. And these are the kinds of things that we'd want to know, right? Like what's the software? What was the vulnerability? We do hope that you are going to disclose that vulnerability and show us, those particular screenshots, the code. What server is this very prevalent? Who else can we notify so that we can potentially prevent a large-scale breach, right? We're thinking about this from really that national security perspective, and certainly respect that you're thinking about this from your own business perspective. And I think we sort of recognize the nature of the economics there, right? Like you are, it's a rational and economically rational thing to want to say, okay, I need to save my business. But if we can work together, then we can also take care of those national security needs too. So, we want to know, what's been exploited, if any customer data has been breached. You talked about the dark web link, right? That could go to the FBI and they could do, further investigation. So there's so much information here that we could all benefit from. And so, being able to work together on that, I think is really incredibly important.
Great.
And I'll just add from the outside counsel perspective, so I don't think the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. And one of the benefits of having experts involved in your incident response process is you can be running parallel work streams. So often as outside counsel, we have really close relationships with the various members of the local field offices, or we know which threat actor groups are tagged to which field offices, and we have those relationships. And we will be the front-facing liaison with law enforcement in the first instance, or government agencies in the first instance, to figure out, are we speaking to the right person? Can they help in this case? The answer is usually yes. And then we're also coordinating with CrowdStrike, because CrowdStrike's going to have a lot of threat intelligence that's going to feed into our decision making, and they're likely going to be helping with the restoration and recovery as well. So they aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. I will say on the vulnerability, we haven't confirmed they're related. I don't know that I would disclose that yet to the FBI or law enforcement just yet. But we're often in the position of sharing IOCs. Once we've reviewed them and are comfortable, we're not putting the company at risk. So it's a very collaborative relationship in my experience.
Well, thank you for picking up on that, because that's one of my pet peeves is I'm giving you discrete facts and we're drawing conclusions. Everybody's thinking, oh, they're related. We don't have any evidence they're related. It can be completely different, right? And there's a risk when you go and you say to the government, there's a security vulnerability and it's resulted in a breach. It becomes conflated, right? So there's always that disconnect between the event and actually knowing what happened, and that can take weeks or even sometimes months. And the more people you notify along the process, the more constituents you have who want to know everything you want to know, right? Everybody wants to know, who was it? When did they get in? How did they get in? What did they touch? What did they take? Everybody wants to know that. Internally, Simon wants to know that. I bet you everybody knows Simon wants to know that. And all the external audiences want to know that too. So you have to manage the process, right? And it can be weeks long, and it's very difficult. And that's where you come in.
Yeah, and we never want the comms to get ahead of the investigative process, that's for sure. But one of the things that you have to think about is being able to give people information that they can use to protect themselves. One of the things that we are seeing, especially in the supply chain attacks as of late, is that companies who have shared early, it's helping their brand reputation. During an incident is not a time when you're going to build your reputation up, but it is a time when you can definitely drop it down very quickly. So from a communication standpoint, again, as soon as you can get information out to your customers, to your stakeholders, to your partners, it is definitely important for your brand.
Yeah, and we want to know, regardless of whether this vulnerability is related, having that information so that we could potentially go to the vendor as well and potentially get a patch for that. The more information, the more quality information that we have on these vulnerabilities, I think really helps us in multiple ways, right? From understanding the security, understanding what's, at risk here, who's involved. And so, this is something that we would definitely want to know.
And we'd ensure to share only known knowns at this point. So that's important, right. not hypotheticals or things that we haven't proven forensically from either Tom or Jay's investigation.
It's very hard to scope it. It's like by the way, we had this vulnerability. There's, how many were there? 21,000 CVEs the year before last. I don't know of an IT team that can affect and implement 21,000 CVE. I don't even know how you do that. I honestly, I'm asked all the time by boards, well, how do we make our patching more effective? I'm like, I don't really know. It's really hard. You have to test the patch, SolarWinds, right? You have to have a process in place. You have to prioritize. You have to worry about operational involvement. It's very challenging just on that one issue, right? So there's a scope issue of how much you say and what you know, and there's a time vector. That's the most important one. It just takes a long time to do these investigations thoroughly and well. All right, so I'm going to pivot just for where I know everybody's tired, and we just have a couple more quick things. We've talked about ransom and what some of the considerations are. Here, the company learns that it can recover on its own, but it's going to take 6 weeks. You've got the decryption key, it's going to take 1 week, right, to Simon's point, right? And the other issue, Simon didn't mention it, which is awesome. This kind of, I know it's this, it's a simulated event, but we have all this data out there. This data is going to be published, right? Is there a value in paying a ransom so that this stuff isn't disclosed? That'll be another consideration, right? But I'm just kind of short-circuited. I'm going to add a couple of, I should tell you this. So the company also is able to get the sample documents down, right? And they look at the samples, and they've done a really good job. Frontlines has done an excellent, excellent job of keeping documents on their server just in case they need them down the line. So they have records from now back 20 years from every user in the company. It's just really great. So, and they can tell that that's what's been affected. There's files from all of those internal share drives, just with everything, big file drive, who knows what's in there. Just a lot of stuff in case you need it. And so the forensic investigation hasn't determined yet, what specifically of those files has been taken, but we know there's about 3 terabytes of data on those servers that were at minimally affected. So that's a factor too. So anybody want to comment on? Well,
we're now questioning our European strategy, and hoping that somebody here is a privacy attorney for GDPR.
There's definitely that. There's also with our partner Dave Diadio, our disclosure obligations under the SEC. Right at this point, if we're looking at this level of exfiltration and availability, we have some things to be discussing about whether we need to drop an 8K, as well as the fact that we have U.S. government clients who are the most patient and willing to wait until you have a good story.
Yep. Yeah. Great. Okay. So now you have the discussion back and forth. Do our law enforcement people want to weigh in on whether there should be a ransom paid? I know Simon put words in your mouth, Mackenzie, but you might want to.
Yeah, so the government isn't in the business of telling companies what to do with respect to whether or not they should pay the ransomware, but I will say 2 things. The first is that you need to be thinking about the fact that you are paying sort of perpetuates a market demand, and if everyone is paying, I do think there's some sort of collective thought process that should go into what that does to the market. And the second is you're taking a risk because you don't know who the actor is on the other side. You have absolutely no idea if that actor is going to come back after you've paid the ransom and demand more money, or if they're going to leak the data that you thought you were recovering anyways. And so while we don't explicitly say don't pay, we do want people to be aware of those risks if they are paying.
Okay, great, for the record. All right, so here, a couple new facts, and it was alluded to this morning, and we've seen a lot of this, so I wanted to end with this last eject. So you guys are kind of wrestling about, you do go to law enforcement, right? Because you haven't decided if you want to make a ransom payment, so just in case you do, you want to go as early as you can, right? You haven't ruled it out. So you go to law enforcement over Simon's objection, and a couple of other things happen. So you start receiving customer calls saying that they're receiving calls from some unknown person or persons, and they're leaving messages on their cell phone, and they're calling work, and they're sending emails to the company saying that their data has been stolen from Frontlines. And so what are they going to do? So the company's calling you. Jen, you're worried about that. Employees are receiving calls on their cell phone, execs, but also all kinds of employees, with somewhat threatening, strange messages. And then there are some reports that certain employees are being threatened with physical visits. And there's a suggestion, it's not that straightforward, but there's a suggestion of physical harm, or at least swatting, right? At least showing up at your house. And there's some reports that in the dark web, there's some addresses being published of employees and names of their kids, you know. So does that change your evaluation about whether to pay ransom? Because these are new things that we're seeing all the time, and we're seeing, you know, a change, sort of a different catalyst for ransom payments by some companies. Does that change your opinion?
So yeah, so
Mackenzie,
just to
does it change
start
the company?
really quickly, I mean, you know, now we're very glad we went to the government. And so again, I think this is where, you know, people make this mistake, and, you know, playing devil's advocate before, you know, sort of saying, you know, we'd be very afraid to go. The real reality of this is that when you have these relationships in government, when you've gone and you have done something for the greater good, I think this is where it really pays off. People don't realize that it's the people behind the data that really get affected.
Right.
This isn't really just about money, and I think that's a great example of it.
And just from a process standpoint too, I think this is where it's also important that your employees across the organization have some awareness. So when something comes into a customer service line or a sales agent, they know what it is and are able to push it up to react, because those levels of escalation should be shared with your board and your leadership team.
And you have a real challenge, because you have to think about, do we tell all employees that this is happening? Do we warn them?
Yeah, and how you frame it, right?
Right.
What word do you use? Do you use the word ransomware, right? Because ransomware automatically elicits a certain type of response and reaction.
Right, and that is a core debate, right, for most companies, is whether to say the ransom event or to publicly disclose the event that may trigger notice, which is not the mere fact of ransom, but it might be the impact of personal data. So very core, key issue. And I'd say, from where I sit, the weight of the practice so far is to not say ransomware unless you have to. That's what I'm seeing out there.
Right,
And
and in regards to even after you may pay a ransom, you still have the long tail. That's the data discovery and the potential cost associated with providing credit monitoring or other services to your victims downstream. So definitely a tough call.
All right, we actually have 2 minutes. I'm going to do one more because I can't help it. You teed me up. All right, so the company pays the ransom, right? Does due diligence. Our friends in government say, we don't see, thanks for the evidence you've given us, we don't see any indication that this threat actor group is associated with anyone on the sanctions list. So you give us a clearance, you give us a little email, which gives the company a great deal of comfort. We know it's not dispositive, but it's very helpful, and it shows partnership. So we got that. We have no more harassment. We have no more threatening calls. We're able to use the decryption key, and we're up, back, and running. Customer impacts mitigated. It is all going very well. We are continuing our investigation, and we do determine, though, that 3 terabytes of data went out the door. The threat actor gives us a deletion log as part of the deal. He says, I deleted it. And here's a log showing the names of the files, deleted, and then I double deleted, consistent with the NIST standard. This is not a lie, right? Consistent with the NIST standard, right? Here it is, here's the log. And he represents that he's not going to misuse this data. He's not going to mine it, he's going to do anything with it, and he got rid of it, okay? So you guys have a choice now, right? We don't really have reason to believe it's going to be misused based on information the U.S. Attorney's given us about the MO. Is these are legit guys, right? They're bad guys, but they play by the rules. If you give them ransom, they're going to follow. They're likely to do what you're going to, expect them to do, and not do anything further with it. The cyber insured comes to the company and says, look, you guys were mentioning that you're going to go through all this data now, and you're going to spend $3, $4, $5 million. It's going to take 10 months to comb through this data to look for little personal information snippets, and then you're going to make this massive notification, which can't go out for like 10 months, right? Because it's going to take a long time to do this. cyber insurer says, that's just not a reasonable expense. We don't think there's any reasonable risk of misuse of this data, and we don't think that the state laws require you to make notice. So we're not going to pay for that. So what does the company do?
As outside counsel, I would say respectfully legal counsel makes that determination. But I think what you need to do is kind of prioritize the review. So it's extremely expensive, as you noted, to go through 3 terabytes of data. So hopefully the company can give us some sense of, by looking at the different file locations of the systems or servers that we know were impacted, of the types of data that are in there. So perhaps we could rule some systems out. We can rule some folders out because we know on a reason, we're not going to know with certainty, but we can have a reasonable, defensible position that we don't think this data would trigger notification law. So maybe we can get the data set down to a more reasonable population, or maybe we know what that population in a worst case scenario would be, and we can make some assumptions.
You're down to 1 terabyte.
We're still looking at a very, very expensive exercise, whether that's through notification or data mining. It's take your pick on which end of the expense you want to spend. But I think it really depends what's the nature of the data. Just because the data was deleted doesn't necessarily mean laws aren't triggered. We know from the forensic analysis that the data was both accessed and acquired, exfiltrated. So I think it helps the narrative. Listen, I'm always looking to find ways to not have to notify if you don't have to. But there's a good story to tell, hopefully, that helps support the narrative that the data's been deleted. We don't anticipate there to be any misuse of the data. But it's all about, in my view, getting to a reasonable and defensible position of you took reasonable steps in your investigation to determine what happened. You may have to make some assumptions along the way. Cost is not to be ignored. Some companies don't have millions of dollars, especially if insurance isn't going to cover it. But so as long as we develop a reasonable and defensible approach and make a decision around whether or not it makes sense to notify in that case.
I'd add, given the client notifications that have to happen here, and the fact that you have U.S. government clients, there's been a significant level of publicity already. So not notifying regulators is not a step I would recommend to Simon as we discuss this internally. We're also playing in a space that's heavily regulated. So we have reputational issues to think about too. If we're seen as being slimy and hiding, there's no benefit to that. So the nominal benefit we get at this point, given the amount we're spending in outside counsel fees,
she's very efficient.
Saving a few $1 million to do the right thing and be able to say to our clients, we did this investigation, here is the outcome, with prioritization, which is appropriate too, far outweighs, in our longer term view, the benefit of saving some money at the end of this.
And I would just add to, it's a great point, having documented the process so that when you're making those materiality determinations, because it's an ongoing assessment, they're informed by the forensic investigation as those are evolving over time. So your position may change, the facts that you understand are going to change over time. So having some record to show and narrative to tell the regulators as to what that process was, I think only adds to your point that it helps the story.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I think you'll all agree with me that if you have a breach, you want all of these people on your incident response team. Well done, everybody. Really good. Thank you.
All right, you guys can sit there for a second. I'll keep this short. We're closing out the conference here. Before I do, I just really want to acknowledge our class of 2020, the COVID class from the cybersecurity program. We have them all here. They didn't receive the recognition they deserve due to COVID, and we brought them all back here, and I have nothing but great things to say about them, so please join me in giving them. Second, to all our corporate sponsors and friends, thank you. Without you, we can't put this together. And then finally, thank you to FBI Boston for all the support. This has been truly been a collaborative effort. It takes all of us here. It's just like cybersecurity. It's not just academia. It's not private industry. It's not government. It's all of us together. And if we don't work together, we're not going to be able to face our adversaries. So with that, everyone have a great day. We have lunch. Take that. And I apologize. There's no open bar this time. So thank you.